There is only one place on Earth where all three ingredients needed to make steel, iron ore, coal, and limestone, sit close enough together that a man could walk from one deposit to the next before lunch. That place is a valley in north-central Alabama, and in 1871, it did not contain a city. By 1910, it contained the largest city in the state, four of the tallest buildings in the American South, and a 60-ton iron god shipped home from the World's Fair. The story of how that happened and what happened after is not the story its founders expected to tell. The valley is called Jones Valley. It runs roughly east to west, squeezed between two ridges of the Appalachian foothills. To the south rises Red Mountain, so named because the exposed rock along its face is stained rust red with iron ore. You can see it from miles away, a long wound in the earth the color of dried blood. Beneath that ridge, seams of coal run deep into the ground, and the limestone sits in outcrops and deposits scattered through the valley floor. For most of human history, this meant nothing. The soil was mediocre for cotton, which is what mattered in antebellum Alabama. The few settlements, Ellerton, Jonesboro, were small, isolated, unremarkable. The minerals waited. What changed was the railroad. After the Civil War, two lines were being built through Alabama, the Alabama and Chattanooga, running east-west, and the south and north, running from Montgomery toward Tennessee. They were scheduled to cross in Jones Valley, and on December 19, 1870, 6 days before Christmas, a group of wealthy men, bankers, planters, railroad entrepreneurs, gathered in the Montgomery offices of a private banking firm called Josiah Morris and Company. They had one agenda: buy the land where those two railroads would meet and build a city on it. They formed the Ellerton Land Company, raised $200,000, a serious sum in the post-war South, and in January 1871 elected as president a man named James R. Powell. Powell was a Virginian by birth, a former Mississippi planter and stagecoach operator, and a promoter of almost theatrical energy. He would earn the nickname the Duke of Birmingham, and he coined the phrase that stuck to the city for the next century and a half: the Magic City. The name Birmingham itself was chosen deliberately, after Birmingham, England, the center of the British iron industry. This was not a city that grew from a settlement. It was a city invented by investors, named for a brand, and sold lot by lot, starting June 1st, 1871. The lots sold, people arrived, and then, almost immediately, the city nearly died. In the summer of 1873, less than 2 years after incorporation, a man known only as Mr. Y moved from Huntsville to Birmingham. 3 days after his belongings arrived, including his bedding, he fell sick. He died. 2 sisters who lived nearby fell ill and died after him. Within weeks, cholera was declared epidemic across the city. Birmingham had roughly 4,000 residents. It had one reliable water source, a creek reservoir 2 miles away. There were no sewers, no sanitation infrastructure, no public health apparatus of any kind. The disease spread through the water supply with hideous speed. By July, stores were shuttered. Trains leaving the city were packed. By the end of summer, half the population had fled. 128 people were dead. Among those who stayed was a woman named Louise Worcester, the proprietor of a house of prostitution on 4th Avenue. She nursed the sick, organized care, spent her own money. The doctors stayed. Mayor Powell stayed. But the city they were trying to save was hemorrhaging. And then, in autumn, the national financial panic of 1873 hit, triggering bank failures and an economic depression that battered what was left. Property values cratered. The Magic City, not yet 2 years old, was nearly a ghost town. It is worth knowing this. It is worth knowing that Birmingham began not with triumph, but with catastrophe, because the ferocity of what followed, the speed, the scale, the sheer appetite of the boom, makes more sense when you understand that the people driving it had already watched the city almost vanish. They built like men who knew the ground could open beneath them. The minerals, of course, did not care about cholera. The iron ore was still in Red Mountain. The coal was still underground. And once the railroads were completed, capital began flowing in from the north, from Tennessee, from anywhere men with money could read a geological survey. The key figure in the first industrial wave was not Powell, but a man named Henry de Bardeleben, an orphan from Autauga County who had been raised as the ward of Daniel Pratt, Alabama's first great industrialist. De Bardeleben was brilliant, reckless, and possessed of what one contemporary called a distinctively Southern tendency toward wild speculations. He married Pratt's daughter. He learned the iron business from the inside. And starting in the late 1870s, he threw himself into the Birmingham district with a gambler's abandon. He formed a partnership with Truman Aldrich and James W. Sloss to develop the Pratt Coal and Coke Company in January 1878 with de Bardeleben as president. They opened slope and shaft mines at Pratt City, tapping the rich Pratt seam, and built a railroad to haul coal from the mines to the furnaces. He built the Alice furnace, named for his eldest daughter, who had died in infancy, which went into blast in November 1880 and marked the first successful use of coke to produce pig iron in the district. Both Aldrich and Sloss left the company by 1881, but de Bardeleben didn't slow down. He traveled restlessly, charming investors everywhere he went. Whenever he left Birmingham, for Texas, for Mexico, once to treat what he feared was tuberculosis, he came back with new money and new partners. By 1886, he and David Roberts, a South Carolina banker he had met in Texas, raised $2 million to form the de Bardeleben Coal and Iron Company, which purchased over 150,000 acres of mineral lands, making it the largest industrial concern in the South. He also founded the town of Bessemer, 10 miles west of Birmingham, building it from nothing into another iron-producing center. He was for a time called the king of the Southern iron world. He operated on instinct, on nerve, on what one admirer called his ability to observe, absorb, and apply, and on a gambler's conviction that the next bet would be the one that paid off forever. Meanwhile, Colonel James W. Sloss, de Bardeleben's former partner, founded the Sloss Furnace Company in 1881, building 2 blast furnaces at the eastern edge of downtown, right at the intersection of 2 major railroads. The economics were staggering. Pig iron cost northern plants around $18.30 per ton in 1884. In Birmingham, the same product could be made for $10 or $11. The reason was simple. The raw materials were right there, practically underfoot, while northern mills had to ship ore and coal hundreds of miles. By the end of the decade, 19 additional furnaces had been erected in or near Birmingham. The Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company, TCI, arrived from the Sequatchie Valley near Chattanooga and built 4 furnaces of its own, quickly becoming the largest enterprise in the district. Woodward Iron Company came in from West Virginia. Pioneer Mining and Manufacturing came from Pennsylvania. The money poured in, and the people followed the money. In 1880, Birmingham's population was 3,086. By 1890, it was 26,178. A growth rate of more than 700% in a single decade. The muddy streets were paved, gas lights went up, telephone service arrived, a public school system was established. The city went from a rough boomtown of saloons and fistfights to something resembling a real city, and fast. Pig iron production in the Birmingham district increased more than tenfold between 1880 and 1890. By the end of the 19th century, Alabama was the 4th highest pig iron producing state in the country, and the Birmingham district was the 3rd largest exporter of pig iron in the world, producing 3/4 of all United States exports. 3/4. The city spawned suburbs almost faster than it could name them. Avondale, Woodlawn, East Lake, Ensley, Pratt City, North Birmingham. Small municipalities strung along the streetcar lines, each with its own charter, its own government, its own claim on the valley's growth. By 1900, an editorial in the Birmingham Age Herald lamented that the city stands before the world belittled by its cramped confines. Boosters argued that the official population, 38,415 inside the city limits, was a fraction of the real metropolitan figure. They were right. In 1907, the Alabama legislature passed the Greater Birmingham Annexation Act, absorbing Ensley, Avondale, Woodlawn, East Lake, and several other communities into the city proper. It took effect on January 1st, 1910, and the result was dramatic. The city's area expanded from 3 square miles to 48, and the population, as counted in the 1910 census, leapt to 132,685. Birmingham threw a census jubilee in November. The Magic City was now the largest in the state, and its leaders believed the growth had only begun. But there was a darkness underneath the boom, and it was not hidden. It was a line item in the state budget. The coal that fed the furnaces was mined, in significant part, by prisoners. Alabama's convict lease system, operational from 1875 to 1928, allowed companies and individuals to pay fees to the state in exchange for the labor of convicted men. By the 1880s, nearly all of the several thousand state and county prisoners working under this system labored in coal mines around Birmingham. The vast majority generated substantial revenue for the state. The convict lease was not an afterthought. It was a profit center. The overwhelming majority of the prisoners were black men, many convicted on charges of vagrancy or petty theft, arrests that surged suspiciously whenever the mines needed labor. In an average year, 97% of Alabama's county convicts were black. When coal companies needed more hands, local police swept through small-town streets targeting black Alabamians for quick arrest. Sentences were short, 60 or 90 days plus court costs, but employers routinely held prisoners past their release dates. TCI operated prison mines at Pratt City. Sloss ran the Coalburg mine with county prisoners. The conditions were medieval. Men were sometimes chained together in ankle-deep water, working 12 to 16-hour shifts. In 1890, 90 out of every 1,000 prisoners died in Sloss's mines alone, a mortality rate that shocked even the inspectors nominally charged with oversight, inspectors who, in practice, inspected nothing. In April 1911, the Banner Mine near Littleton exploded at 6:30 in the morning, killing 128 miners. Of the dead, 125 were convicts leased from state prisons. Within 2 weeks, new convicts were sent to work the same mine. TCI finally let its convict lease contracts expire at the end of 1911. Other companies continued the practice until it was outlawed in 1928. The iron that built Birmingham's skyline, the steel that carried its name across the country, was pulled from the earth by men who had been arrested for the crime of standing on a street corner. The city kept building, and what it built at the start of the 20th century was extraordinary. At the turn of the century, downtown Birmingham was still a low city. 2 and 3 stories, Victorian storefronts, church steeples, the tallest things in sight. Then, in 1902, a man named William Woodward put up a 10-story steel-framed building at the corner of 20th Street and 1st Avenue North. It was Birmingham's first skyscraper, its first building in the Chicago style, and the doubters who questioned whether Birmingham could fill a building that large were wrong. It was fully leased before it opened. 4 years later, the 16-story Brown Marks building rose on the northeast corner of the same intersection. By 1908, an addition more than doubled its size, making it the largest office building in the South. Its principal tenant was the Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company, by then a subsidiary of a company far larger than itself, but that story is coming. In 1909, the Empire Building went up on the northwest corner, 16 stories sheathed in marble and terracotta, briefly the tallest building in Alabama. And in 1912, the John A. Hand Building, 21 stories, 284 feet, completed the quartet on the southeast corner. A magazine article that year called the intersection the heaviest corner in the South. Within a few years, somebody inflated the claim. It became the heaviest corner on Earth. It was absurd, of course, preposterously, delightfully absurd, but it captured something true about the mood of the city. Birmingham was 40 years old. It had 4 skyscrapers at a single intersection, a population about to pass 100,000, and an industrial base that its boosters believed would make it the steel-making capital of the world. They were right about the potential. They were about to learn what it meant to have that potential owned by someone else. The Tennessee Company, TCI, was the dominant player in the Birmingham district, but it was never well managed. Its leadership was more interested in stock speculation than operational efficiency. In 1892, TCI tried to engineer a merger with Sloss and DeBardleben. DeBardleben, unaware that TCI was nearly bankrupt, agreed and lost most of his fortune, the king of the Southern iron world, ruined by a handshake. Sloss's more cautious leaders backed out and survived. TCI lurched through the 1890s, reorganizing, expanding, absorbing smaller companies. In 1895, it moved its headquarters to Birmingham. In 1899, on Thanksgiving Day, TCI's furnaces produced the first significant output of commercially competitive steel in the Birmingham district. The city's boosters could barely contain themselves. Steel, real steel, not just pig iron, from Alabama ore, Alabama coal, Alabama limestone. The dream was becoming real. TCI was briefly listed on the Dow Jones Industrial Average, one of the original 12 companies included in the index when it was first compiled in May 1896. A Birmingham company, among the 12 most important in the United States. The company was fiercely competitive with the larger Pittsburgh steel businesses, and its executives believed, with good reason, that Birmingham's geological advantage would eventually make TCI dominant. All they needed was capital, time, and freedom to compete. They got none of the three. In the autumn of 1907, the panic broke over Wall Street. It began with a failed scheme to corner the copper market and cascaded into a full-blown liquidity crisis. Banks collapsed. Trust companies faced runs. At the center of the storm was J.P. Morgan, the most powerful financier in America, personally organizing rescues, directing capital, functioning as a one-man Federal Reserve. One of the firms in trouble was Moore & Schley, a prominent Wall Street brokerage that had amassed $25 million in debt, much of it collateralized with TCI stock. If Moore & Schley went down, investor confidence, already shattered, might not recover. Morgan saw an opportunity. He proposed that his company, United States Steel Corporation, the world's largest company formed just 6 years earlier, would purchase the TCI shares from Moore & Schley, saving the brokerage and, incidentally, absorbing the most valuable industrial property in the South. The deal had to happen over a weekend. On Sunday, November 3rd, Morgan's men finalized the terms. On Monday, November 4th, they sent 2 emissaries to the White House to ask President Theodore Roosevelt, the trust buster himself, whether the acquisition would provoke antitrust action. Roosevelt, staring at a financial system on the edge of collapse, told them he felt no public duty to object. The deal closed within days. U.S. Steel executives later estimated they had acquired $90 to $100 million worth of coal reserves and infrastructure for roughly $30 million. The local Birmingham newspapers hailed the deal as salvation. U.S. Steel's capital and management would finally unlock the district's full potential. The city would become what it had always been destined to be. What happened instead was Pittsburgh Plus. Pittsburgh Plus was a pricing formula. That is a polite description. In practice, it was a leash. The policy fixed the sale price of steel based on rail shipment costs from Pittsburgh to the point of delivery, regardless of where the steel was actually made. If TCI shipped steel from Birmingham to, say, Atlanta, the buyer paid the same price as if the steel had been shipped from Pittsburgh. The cost advantage that Birmingham's geology had given it, the whole reason the city existed, was erased on a ledger in a corporate office 700 miles away. U.S. Steel did not want Birmingham competing with Pittsburgh. It did not want its southern subsidiary undercutting the profitability of its northern mills. It had not bought TCI to make Birmingham great. It had bought TCI to control Birmingham, and it did. Absentee ownership meant that technical developments, expansion plans, pricing, and labor policies were reviewed and ultimately decided outside the city. U.S. Steel sent a manager named George Gordon Crawford to run TCI, and Crawford was competent, even admirable, investing heavily in infrastructure and ending convict leasing. But the strategic ceiling was set in Pittsburgh. Birmingham could grow, but only as much as Pittsburgh allowed. Federal courts eventually found Pittsburgh Plus illegal, and U.S. Steel abandoned the formal policy in 1924. But the giant corporation simply imposed a new freight pricing structure that limited TCI products to a roughly 300-mile radius from Birmingham. That restriction remained in effect until 1947. By then, the damage was measured not in what happened, but in what didn't. The steel mills that were never built, the fabricators that located near Pittsburgh instead of near cheaper Birmingham iron, the generations of industrial development that went elsewhere because the price signals were rigged. Economists still debate the full impact, but the consensus is clear. Pittsburgh Plus stifled competition, and retarded Birmingham's growth during the decades when the city should have been reaching its full scale. Meanwhile, the city built the things a great city builds, and one thing no other city would have thought to build. In 1903, the Commercial Club of Birmingham, the Chamber of Commerce, decided to send an exhibit to the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis. The state government had pulled out for lack of funds, so the businessmen did it themselves, under the leadership of Club President Frederick M. Jackson and State Fair Director J. A. McKnight. McKnight conceived the idea of a giant Iron Man, and there was a brief debate over which god to sculpt. Vulcan, the Roman god of fire and the forge, ugly, powerful, a blacksmith, or Mercury, the handsome god of commerce. They chose Vulcan, the ugly god, the one who worked with his hands. That choice tells you something about how Birmingham saw itself in 1903. They hired Giuseppe Moretti, an Italian-born sculptor working in New Jersey, and signed a contract in November. Moretti worked in a tall building near Edison's labs in Jersey City, with a crew of 16 men, creating a 56-foot figure standing next to an anvil, holding a spear point in his right hand and a hammer in his left. The full-size plaster molds were cast from pig iron made at Sloss furnaces, Birmingham iron, shaped into Birmingham's self-portrait. The statue weighed 60 tons. It was, at the time, the largest statue ever created in the United States and the second tallest in the country, behind only the Statue of Liberty. They shipped Vulcan to St. Louis in pieces. When the World's Fair opened on May 1st, 1904, he was complete only to his knees. They finished him by June, christened the statue with water from the Cahaba River, and displayed him in the Palace of Mines and Metallurgy with gold lettering on his anvil, "Iron is King, its home, Birmingham, Alabama." He won a grand prize. Both St. Louis and San Francisco offered to buy him. Birmingham said no, shipped him home, and then couldn't agree on where to put him. He sat in pieces for 2 years before being reassembled at the state fairgrounds, where he stood for decades, at one point holding an ice cream cone as part of an advertising deal. It wasn't until the 1930s that a WPA project gave him a proper pedestal on top of Red Mountain, looking down over the city from a height of nearly 600 feet. Some citizens were dismayed by the statue's exposed backside. A gift shop later sold mugs reading "Buns of Iron." Vulcan is still up there, and if you stand at his feet and look north across the valley, you can see the whole story laid out. What's left of the furnaces, the downtown skyline, the ridgeline beyond. Red Mountain runs beneath you, iron ore in the rock under your shoes. In 1913, George Gordon Crawford, the TCI president sent by U.S. Steel, complained to a Birmingham developer named Robert Jemison, Jr. that when his colleagues and bosses came down from Pittsburgh, there was no decent place for them to stay. Jemison, a man who understood the link between civic amenity and economic ambition, took this personally. He recruited Crawford and W.P.G. Harding, president of First National Bank, and together they approached Major Edward Magruder Tutwiler to underwrite the mortgage bonds for a grand hotel. Tutwiler agreed, with one condition. If agreeable, I wish they could call the hotel the Tutwiler. Jemison had a specific motive beyond civic pride. He wanted to convince the American Iron and Steel Institute, 500 members, including the head of United States Steel, to hold its convention in Birmingham. The Institute had declined because the city lacked adequate modern hotels. Jemison and a colleague visited 20 other luxury hotels across the Southeast to study what worked. They chose a site at the corner of 20th Street and 5th Avenue North, next to the Woodward Building. The Tutwiler Hotel opened on June 15, 1914, with 343 rooms and not a single interior guest room. Every bedroom faced the outside, with sunlight pouring in through the windows. The main lobby was entered through a marble public corridor on the 20th Street side, with a separate ladies' entrance on 5th Avenue. Balconies overlooked the lobby from 2 mezzanine levels. 8 large rooms could be opened to form the Grand Ballroom, which for decades hosted the city's most important gatherings. More than 8,000 people turned out on opening night in formal attire to see what the newspapers called the Grand Dame of Southern Hotels. Tallulah Bankhead held her post-wedding party there. Charles Lindbergh gave a press conference in the lobby. The Rotary Club met at the Tutwiler. The Automobile Club met at the Tutwiler. The lobby bristled with cigar stands, florists, a Western Union office, a barber shop, a drugstore, physicians' suites. Country music legend Hank Williams spent his last night alive at the Redmont Hotel, 11 years after the Tutwiler's lobby was already the living room of the city. It was demolished on January 26, 1974, brought down by explosive charges to make room for a bank building. The 1920s in Birmingham looked, from certain angles, magnificent. The population crossed 259,000 by 1930. The Thomas Jefferson Hotel opened on September 7, 1929. 19 stories, 350 rooms, $2.5 million, Spanish Revival architecture by David Oliver Wilden. The Redmont Hotel had opened in 1925, and Hank Williams would spend his last night there in 1953, dying of heart failure on his way to a gig the next day. Downtown was a real downtown. Department stores, theaters, streetcars running along the avenues, crowds filling the sidewalks on Saturday nights. The Jemison Company was developing residential neighborhoods south and west of the city that are still admired for their design. For a brief period in the late 1920s, Birmingham looked like a city that might continue rising indefinitely. The Great Depression shattered that illusion. It devastated the mining and metals industries. Production plummeted, workers were laid off by the thousands, and what had largely been a non-union workforce began organizing in earnest. The Depression hit Birmingham harder than most American cities because the city had so little economic diversification. When iron and steel faltered, there was almost nothing else. During World War II, the industry roared back. The demand for iron and steel to feed the war machine was insatiable, and Birmingham's furnaces burned hot again. By 1941, when America entered the war, U.S. Steel employed more than 45,000 people in the Birmingham district alone. Nearly half the local labor force worked in iron, steel, and mining. More than two-thirds of the industry's workers were African American. The workplace was rigidly segregated. Black workers in the most dangerous jobs, white workers in supervisory and skilled positions, separate facilities, separate pay scales. And it is impossible, it would be dishonest, to tell the story of Birmingham without saying what happened in 1963 and what had been happening for decades before. Birmingham was, by Martin Luther King Jr.'s description, probably the most thoroughly segregated city in the United States. The city's Commissioner of Public Safety, Theophilus Eugene Bull Connor, enforced segregation with dogs, fire hoses, and a willingness to tolerate extra-legal violence that earned the city the nickname Birmingham. Between 1947 and 1965, more than 50 bombings targeted black homes, churches, and businesses in Birmingham. Not a single one was solved. In 1956, after the state banned the NAACP, the Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth and other local ministers founded the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights. Shuttlesworth was beaten, his home bombed. He kept going. In the spring of 1963, Shuttlesworth invited King to Birmingham for what became the Birmingham Campaign: sit-ins, marches, mass arrests. On May 2nd, more than 1,000 children, trained in nonviolent protest, marched from the 16th Street Baptist Church toward downtown. Bull Connor sent police with dogs and fire hoses. The photographs, children knocked off their feet by water cannons, teenagers set upon by German shepherds, went around the world. By May 9th, Birmingham's business leaders agreed to desegregate lunch counters, restrooms, and drinking fountains. Connor left office on May 20th. On the morning of September 15, 1963, at 10:22 a.m., a bomb exploded beneath the steps of the 16th Street Baptist Church. 4 girls, Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, and Carol Denise McNair, were killed. They had been in the basement getting ready for Youth Day services. It was the 21st bombing in 8 years, and the first to kill. In the violence that followed that afternoon, 2 more young black men were killed in the city. The nation watched Birmingham burn and recoiled. The economic consequences were immediate and compounding. Businesses that might have located in Birmingham went elsewhere. National corporations avoided the city. Investment dried up. The racial crisis and the industrial decline were not separate stories. They were the same story, playing out on parallel tracks, each accelerating the other. A city that had been controlled from Pittsburgh for half a century now found itself infamous worldwide for a violence it could not or would not stop. The steel industry, meanwhile, was dying, not quickly, slowly, and then all at once. The post-war period brought competition from rebuilt German and Japanese mills, ironically constructed with American Marshall Plan aid and equipped with technology newer than anything in the aging Birmingham plants. U.S. Steel had never invested in Birmingham the way it invested in Pittsburgh. The whole point of the acquisition had been control, not development. By the 1960s, U.S. Steel was closing mines in the district and importing ore from overseas. In 1964, the company consolidated most of its higher-level administrative offices back to Pittsburgh, a quiet withdrawal that spoke louder than any press release. Woodward Iron, which had operated steadily since the 1880s, went out of business. The United States Pipe and Foundry Company, which had acquired Sloss Sheffield in 1942 and invested heavily in a massive new blast furnace in North Birmingham, a facility that took from 1956 to 1958 to build, found that by the time it was ready, German and Japanese furnaces were exporting iron to the United States at prices lower than Birmingham's. The timing was devastating. A brand new furnace, obsolete before it produced its first ton. Sloss furnaces poured their last iron in 1970 and went dark after 90 years of continuous operation. The Jim Walter Corporation, which had acquired the site, donated it to the Alabama State Fair Authority, which concluded the furnaces were unsalvageable and planned to demolish them. A group of Birmingham residents fought the demolition and won. The furnaces opened as a National Historic Landmark in 1981. They are still standing, massive, rusted, silent, visited by tourists who try to imagine the heat. The Ensley Works, TCI's great steel plant, the heart of the Birmingham district's production, closed in 1976. The Fairfield Works survived longer, kept alive by modernization. U.S. Steel opened a new $412 million electric arc furnace there in 2020, but at peak, 45,000 people worked for U.S. Steel in Birmingham. Today, the number is a small fraction of that. What replaced the steel was something no one in 1871 or 1907 or even 1950 would have predicted. In 1936, the University of Alabama established a small extension center in downtown Birmingham to serve adults seeking business and education courses. It was modest, almost invisible. In 1944, the medical college relocated to Birmingham, and the extension center began serving its students. The campus grew, slowly at first, then faster, propelled by GI Bill enrollment and by a growing city that needed a university. In 1966, the University of Alabama at Birmingham, UAB, was formally established as an independent institution. By 1976, it was Birmingham's largest employer, surpassing U.S. Steel. Think about that timeline. In the same decade that the furnaces went cold, a university and medical center became the economic center of the city. Today, UAB and its health system employ more than 26,000 people. The annual economic impact on the state exceeds $7 billion. UAB Hospital is one of the 20 largest in the United States. Forbes named UAB the #1 best large employer in America in 2021. The city that was built to make iron is now, fundamentally, a medical and research center. The ore is still in Red Mountain. Nobody mines it. The banking story is worth knowing, too, because it reveals something about what Birmingham became once the steel identity faded. Charles Lynn, a Swedish immigrant and former ship captain, founded the National Bank of Birmingham in 1872, 1 year after the city's incorporation. That bank eventually became First National Bank, then AmSouth Band Corporation. Meanwhile, the Birmingham Trust and Savings Company, founded in 1887, became South Trust Corporation. Regions Bank, First Alabama Bank Shares, Compass Bank Shares. They all grew up in Birmingham. By the late 1990s, 4 of the top 50 banks in the United States were headquartered in downtown Birmingham. Only New York City had more. Birmingham had quietly become one of the largest banking centers in the South, a fact that would have bewildered the iron makers. The consolidation wave took some of them. Wachovia acquired South Trust in 2004. Regions merged with AmSouth in 2006. A $10 billion deal that created a company with more than $147 billion in assets. Regions Financial Corporation is still headquartered in Birmingham, a member of the S&P 500. The Region's Center, a 30-story modernist tower at 20th Street and 5th Avenue North, sits 5 blocks from the heaviest corner on Earth. The interstates came through in the 1960s and did what interstates did to every American downtown. They gutted it. Interstate 59/20 carved through the city center, and the route was not chosen by accident. It cut directly through black neighborhoods, severing communities from their commercial districts, demolishing entire blocks. Before the highway, there had been a well-defined neighborhood in the path. Homes, businesses, a coherent community. After the highway, there was concrete and noise and an absence where life had been. Look at a map of Birmingham today, and you can see it. The grid shifts, the geometry breaks, the streets don't connect where they should. That is where the highway went. Streetcars, which had knitted the city together since the 1880s, were gone by 1953, killed by the same forces that killed streetcars everywhere. A combination of automobile lobbying and a genuine shift in how Americans wanted to live. The suburbs incorporated independently, largely in response to school desegregation orders in the 1950s and 1960s, creating dozens of small municipalities, Mountain Brook, Vestavia Hills, Homewood, Hoover, that ringed Birmingham and drained its tax base. Attorney David Vann launched a One Great City campaign in 1970 to merge the suburbs back into Birmingham, the way the 1910 annexation had done. Polls showed 65% support among suburban residents. The proposal died in committee in the Alabama State Senate in 1971. It was never seriously attempted again. The city's population peaked at 340,887 in 1960. By 2020, it was 200,733. The metro area, though, tells a different story. About 1.1 million people, the largest in Alabama. The city proper lost population. The region held. This is the paradox that Birmingham shares with 100 other American cities, but it is sharper here because the city was incorporated so late and hemmed in so early. The 1910 Greater Birmingham annexation, which absorbed Ensley, Avondale, Woodlawn, East Lake, and others, tripling the population to 132,000, was the last successful merger. Every attempt since has failed. Birmingham is a large metropolitan economy governed as if it were a collection of hamlets. There is one more thing to see from the top of Red Mountain, standing near Vulcan. The Tutwiler Hotel is gone, demolished in 1974, replaced by a bank. But in 1986, a developer converted the Ridgely Apartments, a 1914 building a few blocks away, into a new hotel called the Tutwiler. The name came back, even if the building didn't. The Thomas Jefferson Hotel closed, caught fire, stood vacant for years, and was eventually converted to apartments. The Empire Building, one of the 4 skyscrapers on the heaviest corner, is now the Ealaton Hotel, named for the settlement that existed before Birmingham did. The Brown Marks Building, which housed TCY's offices while U.S. Steel dictated its pricing from Pittsburgh, was renovated in 2018. Sloss Furnaces sit open to the sky, a museum and event space where people hold art shows and Halloween festivals among the blast stacks. The cast houses and hot stoves are orange with rust, and in certain light they look like the ruins of a cathedral. The ore tunnels in Red Mountain are sealed. The Fairfield Works hum with a fraction of their former workforce. U.S. Steel opened a new electric arc furnace there in 2020, a $412 million investment in a facility that employs a few hundred people, where tens of thousands once worked. And Vulcan stands on his pedestal above it all, 56 feet of Birmingham iron, holding a spear point over a city that no longer makes the metal he is made of. His backside still faces south toward the suburbs that left. A visitor walked the heaviest corner on Earth not long ago and asked locals about the history. Nobody he spoke to knew the story. He had to look it up on the internet. The iron is still in the mountain,